just to make it to all of you that the money that we donated was raised by the executive and donated independently of any political donations. So that's for all of you who may have donated to the party and wondered why we were sub-donating it to another charity. So do we have Mike? Let me make the land acknowledgement before we start, or while we're waiting for Mike to give us greetings from Kitchener Centre. So tonight, I would like to acknowledge that this land on which we live was inhabited and cared for many generations by the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples. We are here tonight to discuss money, so it's appropriate to imagine the gift economy that Indigenous peoples use. Robin Wall Kimmerer, author of Braiding Sweetgrass, put it this way, quote, "The abundance of berries feels like a pure gift from the land. I have not earned, paid for, nor labored for any of them. There's no mathematics of worthiness that reckons I deserve them in any way, and yet here they are, along with the sun and the air, the birds and the rain. You could call them natural resources or ecosystem services, but I know them as gifts." So, right? So if we don't see Mike, I mean, Mike is busy as an MP, so he may not, in fact, be able to join us. Hold on. So Mike is actually about to join us.
Hi there. Oh, you and Wendy? Looked like a nice box with something for the lawn or the garden or a lawn chair. Oh, oh, nice.
Okay, don't.
Mike.
Hello.
Okay, we're gonna just make you bigger here on the screen. Okay, can you hear me, Mike?
I can, yep.
Great, we can all hear you here, so go ahead whenever you're ready. Welcome.
Oh, great. Well, hey, yeah, thanks for having me, everyone. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. I can't see folks, but hopefully you can see me. I assume there's some folks there in person and some online. For those I've not met before, my name is Mike Morris. I'm the MP for Kitchener Centre, one of two Green MPs in the House of Commons, of course. Want to start by saying thank you to you all for what you're doing right now. This is so important that Greens are continuing to come together, to bring folks in, to be learning from them in these really important years, long before an election gets called. In my view, this is the really important work in our communities in between elections. That involves knocking on doors. It involves connecting with folks in our communities. And one of the most important is staying connected with one another as Greens and building that community in these really important years. And so, an honor for me to be with you tonight, at least for the first part, before I have to head to some events here in my community in Waterloo Region. And I understand we've got a pretty wonderful lineup for tonight that, like I said, I think it's just so important. So maybe I'll leave it there. If folks have any questions they want to hear from me about in terms of the work that Elizabeth and I are doing in the House of Commons, happy to take a question or two if there's time for that.
Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Mike about working with Elizabeth in Ottawa? I think we're good, Mike. So thank you. Good.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'll head back onto mute. I'll listen in for the first part.
Hi, Mike. I had a question actually, because I know you're in Kitchener Centre and Ashlyn Clancy is now the Green MPP in Kitchener Centre. And has that made your job any easier?
Oh, what a lovely question. Who am I speaking with? What's your name?
Was that Ashlyn has joined you as the MPP for Kitchener Centre. So has that made your life easier having a compatriot in Kitchener Centre?
Yeah. What I've found is when we have more people elected as Greens who are focused on the needs of their communities ahead of their political parties, it's a whole lot easier to get things done. And so working with Ashlyn has been a real joy over these last number of months. So many of the issues we're facing, when it comes to climate, for example, Elizabeth and I are pushing really hard for strong regulations when it comes to clean electricity. But it's the province that is the one putting natural gas back on the grid and building more natural gas-fired electricity generation. So to have an ally in Ashlyn to put pressure provincially while we advocate federally when it comes to electricity grid, to two-way all-day GO train service, to the housing crisis. So many of these issues, of course, cross federal and provincial jurisdiction. So it's been a real joy working with her, most of all because, in my view, we should have more people elected who are thinking community first, party second. And I'm really proud that as Greens, that's the way we approach things. It's also been a real boost of affirmation. I'm not sure you folks probably saw the results from that by-election, but Ashlyn received 48% of the vote on election night, as compared to, back in years past, we were around 3% of the vote. So to see that kind of jump is really a testament to all of the volunteers over many, many years who I think built the support in our community to show our community what green values look like in action. So yeah, working with Ashland is a real joy. And nice to have the Ontario legislature having two green MPPs alongside us two as green federal MPs.
Okay,
Thank you for the question.
Good, thank you. So it's 2 for 2, 2 provincial, 2 federal.
You
So
got it.
I'd like to move on to, so thanks very much, Mike, for joining us, and it's an honor to have you introduce the evening. I mentioned
Thanks
that
for having me here. Thank you.
Talked about gifts instead of natural resources or ecosystem services. In fact, the same was said by the Enlightenment French physiocrats who believed that all value came as a gift from nature, and Adam Smith changed that. Adam Smith also commented on the strange new paper money being introduced in the colonies, and his misunderstanding is still with us today. Misunderstanding money leads to austerity thinking that's done so much harm to people everywhere. In Canada, during the Chrétien, Martin, and Harper years, in the US, the European Union, and most recently in the UK, which has been eviscerated by 14 years of austerity politics. Yet here in Canada today, we're once again being told that austerity is the path to a better future. Today, Mario Seccareccia will speak to us about money and austerity, and will tell us why this is not true. Mario is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Ottawa, where he's been teaching economics since 1978. During his long academic career of over 4 decades, Mario has been a visiting professor at several universities, primarily in France and Mexico. He has published over 130 academic articles and chapters of books, edited or co-edited approximately 50 special issues of peer-reviewed international journals, and authorized or edited over a dozen books. Mario is also editor of the International Journal of Political Economy and a research associate at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and the Monetary Policy Institute. Mario recently received the 2017 Sesquicentennial Medal from the Senate of Canada and the 2021 John Kenneth Galbraith Prize in Economics from the Progressive Economics Forum for his academic achievements and his service to the wider community. Since his retirement in 2018 at the University of Ottawa, Mario has actively lobbied for the replacement by the Bank of Canada of its single goal mandate of a 2% inflation target in favor of a multi-goal mandate, including full employment and a more equitable income distribution. So please join me in welcoming Mario. And Mario, over to
you. Excuse me, I don't know if you could hear me well. Great. I wish to thank Don first and foremost, because he contacted me a while back. And when he mentioned that he knew a good friend of mine, Warren Mosler, I right away said, absolutely, I'll be happy to engage in this sort of exchange here and do a presentation. But I should warn you that I actually did so with the Green Party. I was invited almost a quarter century ago in 2000, when I spoke at a session on exactly the idea of wanting to plant a seed, as Don has used that terminology here, okay, in terms of having a macroeconomic policy goal or goals out there that should be specific to your party. And at the time, I was, in fact, accompanied. And it had just happened that way because I think it was around in August. I can't remember the exact dates right now, but I remember it was in 2000. And I was accompanied by a colleague from France who happened to be visiting our department at the time by the name of Alain Palguez. And we both spoke at that session. You know, I was involved in the initial presentation, but then he intervened, and we did our thing, so to speak. But I don't think it went very far. Okay, I can tell you right now, and stopped there. So in a sense, here I am. What is it? 24 years later, almost. Okay, to bring up this issue again, and the way I have framed my presentation is in a sense the way Don kind of asked of me almost by writing up the description initially. And I was happy with that description, and I will follow that route as we'll see in a minute here. But if you give me 1 second, I'm going to try to share the screen in order to go through the actual PowerPoint presentation here. Let me just get that. All right. Okay. Can everybody see this? Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you. Let me begin here. This is the title that, in fact, it was Don who gave it to me, but as I said, it's perfectly fine. And I'm
بدون
happy.
موز قدامي يا منى بلا لحمة.
Okay.
Oui.
Okay, maybe people should sort of mute themselves here at this point. Thank you. Now, let me begin here by, because he asked me to begin with what is perhaps the biggest problem when it comes to especially macroeconomic policy issues, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of what is money. And the reason why it's so important is because much of what we will see in terms of policies that what I would call the mainstream of economists tend to subscribe to is based on what I would call a rather absurd, almost, certainly an inappropriate understanding of what is money that goes back literally to the Middle Ages, as we'll see in a minute. Okay. And it is on the basis of that if we are able to get a better grasp of what is money, we could then, needless to say, also would be able to break away from these sort of doctrines that tend to impose themselves, willy-nilly, literally here, on our profession and more generally on politicians who are then become, as Keynes would say, enslaved to some sort of academic scribbler out there that really is rehashing what is a kind of theory that is long past. Now, let me begin by starting to try to explain what is money. Well, here, as you know, here in theory, all of us, each and every one of you, in a sense, or us, can issue an IOU. I could just simply take from you something and write a note to say, I owe you whatever it is, $10 or whatever it may be, on whatever actually doesn't have to be even in the unit of account that we have here, which is the Canadian dollar. And we have a liability. Now, in Canada, historically, until the founding of the Bank of Canada in 1934, commercial banks, some of you would know, actually issued their own private banknotes that they circulated. That was common circulated pieces of paper, so to speak, okay, or IOUs. And indeed, the whole notion of a bank charter, or what we call nowadays chartered banks, originates from a term going back to Latin word here called charta or carta, which means issuing a paper note that would be generally accepted and would circulate as currency in an economy. One of the most famous economists, monetary economists of the 20th century is a fellow by the name of Hyman Minsky, an American economist who I had the pleasure of actually meeting on a number of occasions over my lifetime. and who wrote a quite famous statement that is, well, if you dig up in the let's say on Google or whatever, you will find it pretty much plastered in a lot of places, and it's what what he said about money, which is that everyone can create money. The problem, of course, is to get it accepted. Now, obviously, money rests on being trustworthy, so to speak. There's got to be some trust, something that will drive people to accept it. And hence, has an IOU that, in a sense, it needs to be accepted for it to be circulated. But why would anybody want to accept whatever IOU that you and I or some institution out there would be circulating, so to speak? Well, the answer, of course, most people certainly wouldn't accept my IOU or yours, but clearly there are certain determinants of what would encourage the public to accept, let's say, a private, in this case, commercial bank issue of, let's say, a banknote once again, or a government issued IOU by the central bank. Now, to explain this acceptance here that we're talking about here, there are two broad and rather conflicting historical traditions in monetary economics that I have described in a simple way as being either the mainstream view or the non-mainstream view nowadays. That if, in fact, if you pick up textbooks in first-year economics, you will find that it will be the mainstream view that they will always present to you, and rarely will they present the non-mainstream view, okay? However, in actual historical record, so to speak, the oldest tradition is what I would call here the non-mainstream view that is often referred to nowadays as the chartalist or cartalist tradition in economics that goes back literally to antiquity. It originates with the rise of state power, if you wish, and it originates during times going back to antiquity where the power of the state now was used in order to be able to, through the legal system, enforce what we could call a legal tender money, meaning money that would be generally accepted by the public for the purpose of buying and selling, commodities in these organized markets that even existed, let's say in ancient Rome or Greece or whatever. Okay? Now, in all organized society, where there exists a state authority, the state, of course, is going to want to command resources. The money that it issues emerges, therefore, as I would call this an order, a command on the system of production to access goods and services in an economy, in a society. But then the question arises, why would anyone want to actually give up real resources? Let's say if you produce grains or potatoes or whatever you produce, okay? Why would you want to voluntarily give those up to accept, in this case, a state IOU in return? Well, this is, of course, I would say for two reasons. One, of course, is because normally we don't live in a vacuum and it's been generally accepted. So if there's a generally accepted circulating medium that we use, let's say in this case, the Canadian dollar, we will, of course, continue to use that. We certainly will not question that. For a facility state, I mean, you certainly would not debate that. But imagine, I remember with Warren, that when I first met Warren in the 1990s, it was at the time of the referendum in Quebec. And he actually wrote a piece that I translated for Le Devoir, and it was published in 1997, if I remember correctly, in Le Devoir, where he said to them, basically, well, if you want to actually separate, why in the world don't you also set up your own currency? Because otherwise you would still be fully dependent on whatever is in this case, the Canadian dollar that would dominate in Quebec society. What's the logic of that? And at the time, he argued that if you actually are serious about that, about setting up your own sovereign state, you must also have your own currency. In this case, how do you do it? Well, his answer was, of course, to make your own currency legal tender, you must impose taxes on your citizens in the sense of paying taxes in that currency. Hence, what we could see here is that tax-driven money, okay, creates the demand for it. And in ancient societies in which monetary exchange was not really central, as it is nowadays in modern capitalistic economies, this system worked and was uncontested. Because, of course, taxes were often collected in kind, and monetary exchange was pretty marginal. It would be in some medieval village fair that would happen every month or whatever. And hence, they would be, in this case, circulating what mainly agricultural products generated in these rural communities, where, as I said, money was rather peripheral to their activities. So it didn't really lead to any major debates as to this notion of charterless money here, as we're calling it. Except that in the Middle Ages, there emerged a debate. And it arose at the time as these societies were engaging in greater and greater commercial activities, with the rise of a sort of merchant class that was specializing in the buying and selling of goods and and services, whatever, to these communities, as we see in these growing markets, in fairs, village fairs, whatever they would be at the time. And it is in that context that they got into greater and greater conflict over taxation. Okay? Now, all these conflicts over money and taxes, because you had to pay your taxes in that currency that was issued by the authority, led to conflicts during the 13th, but especially in the 14th centuries AD. And this was because of the dominance of commodity money at the time. Normally, some element of precious metals that would be in these coins. And this was before, of course, the invention of the Gutenberg press, as you know, in the mid-15th century. And many of the debates arose because of the nature of commodity money, as we'll see in a minute. Now, at the time, the dominant view, going back to antiquity, based on the sort of chartalist view or theory, gave the right to the king or to the prince, in the Machiavellian sense here, if you wish, to the prince to issue coins in the kingdom. However, these cash-strapped authorities that were in search of liquidity because they were fighting a war, for instance, in the case of France in the 14th century, it was the 100-year war between France and England. Okay? And at one point, they took up, they captured the king of France, and they had to pay ransom, and they needed cash. So here's a good example of crises where it generates debates. And these cash-strapped authorities that needed liquidity, what they would do is that they would often be tempted to modify the precious metal content of coins, which the rising bourgeoisie or merchant class saw as a kind of hidden or indirect taxation on the part of the state. And what this meant, of course, is that if they would modify the precious metal content so that instead of having gold, let's say, or silver, they would also include other, alloys here, such as, iron or copper, or whatever, then what it would do is that it would allow the state to extend the amount of actual currency that it could issue, as you could see. And this led to innumerable debates at the time. And it arose, of course, only because of the fact that they were still using precious metals, or metals, if you wish, at the time, which, of course, led to all sorts of issues. One example that I put here on my slide is the example of the so-called Gresham's Law that appeared that became popular in the 15th century, but which in fact exists, they had been stated even before, as we were saying during these debates earlier in the Middle Ages, which is the idea that bad money chases good money out of circulation. Now, bad money, what do we mean by that? Well, of course, it meant that it would be something that would have been modified here as coin, that it would not be just gold, let's say, but it would include some other metal alloy. And therefore, people would then, what would they do? They would hoard the one with, that has the more pure gold example, let's say, or silver or whatever, and would circulate the bad money here that would be more tampered with, so to speak. Okay, so what we have here now, this, of course, all this arises simply because we're using commodity money. Some of you who are old enough might recall that in Canada we used to have silver coins. Until 1967, we used to have dimes and quarters in silver. Of course, once they changed that, what did people do? They all hoarded those silver coins. So in a sense, it's a problem to do with using actual commodity money. Okay. Now, it is from these medieval debates over the nature of commodity money that there actually came the notion that whether it is coins or paper currency, remember with the Gutenberg press now, they are going to start using paper, what they used to call paper credit, issued by the banks in the form of banknotes, okay? Or fiduciary or trustworthy money would have to be fully backed by precious metals, even if it's paper currency, from which came the term metallism or bimetallism. That is to say, a monetary system based on gold and silver. And even therefore, with the invention of paper currency, including, of course, government or private banknotes, or what we refer to normally describe it as scriptural money, these paper currencies had to be backed by reserves of precious metals. At least there was that pretense at the time. Now, it was backed by law by the 19th century, as we're going to see, because they set up a whole international monetary system that was developed by the 19th century and often referred to as the gold standard. Each country would fix its currency price of gold, which meant, of course, that we would have an international fixed exchange rate system. And each country's central bank would only issue currency that is based on gold reserves or precious metals of other types, if it's bimetallism, for instance, as in the United States. Now, this system, the gold standard, of course, worked somewhat in good times, but of course was pretty dysfunctional, especially during certain crisis periods or wars. For instance, the amount of liquidity in the system, since it depended on the amount of gold reserves, obviously depended on gold discoveries. So you're going to have periods when there's, like in the Klondike, you're going to have a lot of gold coming into these markets, but there are going to be other periods where there will be scarcity of it. But more importantly, normally, the whole system was deflationary. In fact, it was what I call here a deflationary disciplining device. Because whenever a country got into a balance of payments problem, say by running a trade deficit, where it imports more than it exports, for instance, it would then have to deflate, meaning that they would have to get incomes to shrink in order to be able to adjust themselves to the parity of the gold standard rate. And a good example of how these conflicts, if you know a little bit about the history of Britain, of England in particular, some of you will recall that there was a coal miners' strike in 1926, and it was exactly over this whole question of the gold standard that they were trying to reestablish after the First World War. Moreover, every time there was a war, like the First World War, governments would, of course, abandon it. They wouldn't function. They would not, let's say, respect those conditions that would be, these rigid conditions established by the gold standard. And in fact, the big shock was, of course, the Great Depression. And the gold standard collapsed in 1931. And in fact, countries never went back to that original gold standard. Now, although there were other types of monetary systems that were developed after the Second World War, the most important being the so-called Bretton Woods system, after World War II. And nowadays we have a kind of multipolar world where we have, as we could see, where the BRICS want to abandon, the so-called group of, the BRICS countries want to abandon altogether the US dollar as a unit for invoicing purposes, and transaction purposes internationally. And we never went back to and in fact, with the collapse of Bretton Woods as well, we never went back to anything that resembles that gold-based view of money. In fact, the closest that we ever got to something like that, and it had nothing to do with metallic standards or anything of the sort, was when central banks in the 1970s and 1980s adopted monetarism. Some of you may have heard of it, which pretended at the time as if money is a commodity that central banks can somehow control directly by means of simply controlling the base money that they issue. Okay, but they failed because they had everything upside down, as we're going to see. Okay, now then the question is, what is money, or what is modern money? Now, I've taken two quotes that I purposely took out because remember what I said earlier. I gave a talk. It wasn't on this, by the way, but it was about the issue of the public finances, as we'll see, that gave a talk in 2000. And there was my colleague, Alain Parguez, and I, who were there. And in 2000, we had published a chapter of a book, okay? And that was, in fact, in a book called What is Money? Okay, and we presented what we called then the credit theory of money, okay, or the so-called monetary circuit approach to money, okay. And in fact, we have two quotes from this is right from the first page of that chapter, okay. I will read maybe one of them. I don't want to read them all because I don't, but I have them available here. But let me just read one of them. It's a bit cryptic. It's not so easy to follow, but I'll try to explain this differently in a minute. Okay? But let me just quote this. Money is the byproduct of a balance sheet operation of a third agent who in modern parlance here can be dubbed a bank. Now, it need not be a commercial bank, by the way, but it may. In particular, money always emerges as a debt or liability issued by the third agent on itself, which has as counterpart a credit simultaneously granted to buyers of goods and services within an economy. And in this three-way balance sheet relation, every transaction entails the simultaneous creation or destruction of debt. And every seller of goods and services accepts payment of this bank liability on the basis of its general purchasing power. Now, I don't know, it sounds pretty awful. I mean, to try to make sense of this, it's heavy in its articulation here. But just to simplify it, think of it and say, every time you make a transaction, now if you forget for a moment actually using your purse here in terms of coins or paper, let's say currency, imagine when we purchase many things nowadays, we do it through your debit card or through checks or whatever. And indeed, what we do right away is access a third party, in this case, your bank usually, okay, the charter bank that handles your, let's say in your case of your deposits. And these deposits are the liability of that charter bank that you could access supposedly anytime, unless they are going belly up or there are specific problems faced by these banks, as we have seen historically, not nowadays in Canada. But even in the 1980s, we had two major bank failures at the time that did create these kind of problems. So what I'm getting at here is that it's a debit credit relation, meaning that it arises, okay, as a result of the fact that the bank issues, in this case, let's say, makes out a loan, and at the same time, it appears on the balance sheet of the bank, on the liability side, as a deposit that you are able to access and then engage in a transaction. Just to show you this, I have a diagrammatic kind of relationship that sums up what we could call here the monetary circuit view of a private bank money system. Okay. And what we have here is, on the one hand, on your left here, on your extreme left, you have banks who are going to make out a loan. Now, it need not be only to firms, but the firms are central to the system, as we're going to see in a minute. We could include also loans made out to you as if you want to buy a car, let's say, or whatever it might be. Okay. But for the time being, imagine the central kind of system that we have here, which is that banks issue credit by making out a loan to a credit-worthy borrower here, a firm in this case, that is going to use it to hire, let's say, workers to pay them an income Y. So it borrows M that is created and issued by the bank. Okay, it is then generates an income that is paid out, let's say, to the workers or even others, dividends, could be for other reasons, but primarily to workers in the form of wages to engage in production. Okay. In turn, these households then, what do they do with that income? Well, obviously, they have the choice of either spending it by consuming or by saving it. That portion that they consume, which is we'll call it, we'll use a symbol C, as we'll see in a minute, which is what households consume. The remainder will be what they save. So think of it, they spend a portion, which is 1 minus S, which is S, we'll call it the propensity to save of these households out of their income. And therefore, 1 minus that would be their propensity to consume, what they're actually going to consume. And the remaining residually is the savings here of households that are then, what do they do with it? Well, this is the question. If they hold it as pure liquid bank deposits, it creates problems of what we could call short-circuiting of the circuit of money here, okay, of bank money. Or alternatively, which is the whole strategy of firms, if they don't get enough money to pay the M plus an interest R on it, okay, then of course they would have to capture it by issuing securities in the financial or bonds, whatever, in the financial capital markets. And these bonds are then captured. This is the money that will be captured by firms so that they could reimburse and, in a sense, close the circuit, so to speak. But if it's held either in your cookie jar, if it's literally liquid, if it's cash or whatever, or if it's in the form of bank deposits, let's say in this case, which is the one that I'm most concerned about, because we do hold bank deposits of a significant amount, some of us. Okay. This, of course, is money withdrawn from circulation. Okay. Which means that firms cannot fully reimburse the banks. They cannot capture the full M to reimburse. I also have on top here, just as a kind of matter of fact here, that the banks pay interest on deposits, some of that money. And they also pay bank workers, so there's income of the bank workers, what be here, okay? That also goes into the household sector that spends their income in total. But the point I'm trying to make is that we could have a complete closure of the circuit only if, of course, these bank deposits are negligible. If they are significant, if there's strong liquidity preference, as Keynes said in the 1930s, where people want to hold money in their mattress, etc., then it creates problems of demand in the economy because they will not be, because of course firms will not be able to fully pay back their the principal plus interest. Okay. Now, that's the relationship within the private sector. So money is created and money is destroyed when of course, the debtors here, in this case, these firms would be paying back their loans. Okay. Now, there's also another interaction that is extremely important, which the people which modern monetary theorists, or MMTers as they refer to, have normally emphasized, okay? Which is the link, or to call it the circuit here, between the government through its central bank and the treasury, and of course, the banks or firms and households, the private sector. Okay. Now, every time the government spends money, every time there's government spending, okay, what will happen, of course, is that it will, if it's, now it depends on how it's borrowed, but clearly it will be not only be paying out whatever it is in terms of goods or services that it will benefit from, let's say building a road, etc. But also, of course, this will be money that will then appear within the banking sector, initially as an income, and then if they don't spend all of it, again, residually, it will be remaining. But also because they will create what we call reserves in the banking sector. They will generate what in Canada we used to call reserves, but since the 1990s, we refer to them as positive or negative, depending on which way we go, of what we call settlement balances. Meaning that if it's money that is issued by the state, where the Treasury has issued, let's say, bonds that are purchased by the central bank and used for the purposes of buying whatever, okay, goods or services by the government, this will increase the amount of settlement balances in the system. Okay. Conversely, if it's tax receipts, okay, it's the opposite. If let's say nowadays we're paying in April, whatever, we're paying residually our taxes that we haven't paid enough, let's say during the year, for instance, according to our existing tax rules and tax rates, then what happens in this case, of course, is that we're going to be draining the banking sector of these reserves that will push them into a negative settlement balance. Okay, so think of this like a seesaw. Depending on which way you go, you're going to have government spending that pushes these reserves or these settlement balances into a positive category. Or conversely, if it's tax receipts, it's going to be the opposite. But they also do other things. They purchase government securities in the open market, or they could sell government securities in the open market, etc. Okay, all of these could impact on the amount of reserves or the amount of settlement balances in the system. Now, why is this so important to highlight? Well, the reason, of course, is because imagine for a moment when the government, let's say, wants to spend money to pay its civil servants, and let's assume that it wants to balance its books. Well, if it's in January and it has to wait until April for everybody to pay its taxes, how in the world could it then be able to do it? Well, obviously, it would have to automatically access the central bank. Okay, and it would do it all the time. It's a continual process of borrowing, so to speak, here from the central bank that in turn will then be extinguished. So at the end, for instance, by May or June, it may end up in a surplus situation rather than a deficit, but the initial thing will be a deficit. Okay, during those months when it's not receiving as much tax receipts as it needs to balance its book. So even if it wants to, let's assume if you're a Pierre Poilievre kind of character here and wants to balance the books, absolutely, you can't do it. You could only do it within a certain period of time. You could only do it after the fact, meaning once you've got all your tax receipts in order and you got spending that has already been done, then of course you will be able to either spend more or tax more, depending, in order to eventually try to balance this. But the whole point of this exercise here is to say that on a day-to-day basis, it's impossible to balance anything. Okay, because it has ongoing expenditures, and its receipts are going to be coming in bundles. Again, that will not necessarily be synchronized in any sort of way. Okay, now, so the whole point of this here is that what MMTers have argued here is that central banks are always, in a sense, there to address whatever requirements of the state, the government here, in terms of expenditure needs here, that it has to fulfill through this financing. And it goes on all the time, okay? Now, this, of course, leads us to another important element of what we shall call the MMT story here, okay? And it comes from this, and I remember I told Don that this will be the only equation or group of equations here. I'm just fiddling around with the same equation, by the way, okay, that I will show you, okay? But it's important to see it because it is a pure accounting identity, okay? And some of you who have if you've ever taken a first-year course in economics, would be familiar with this, of course, because it's what we call the national counting identities or equation, okay? And it comes from a simple kind of accounting exercise here, where, of course, we account for all the receipts and the expenditures. And indeed, as we know by definition, every receipt, everything I get would have to have been an expenditure for someone else, okay? By definition, okay? So we got, let's say, in terms of gross expenditures in an economy, we have certain categories that we refer to. Remember earlier, I was talking about consumption. Well, one of them is consumption expenditures. Now, what do we mean by consumption expenditure? Of course, goods and services that we purchase and consume, not only, when we buy an apple, let's say we devour it that day, but more importantly, also goods that are more durable in character, including consumer durables like a refrigerator, even a car, okay? Now, there's also investment, which is what we would often refer to as business capital formation, okay? Business fixed capital formation here. And then there's, of course, government spending or government expenditures. Those are also on the expenditure side. And And then there's this other X minus M, which is the exports minus the imports. Think of it, if it's just exports of goods or services minus the imports, they'll give you the trade surplus, okay? Or what we call, if you generalize it, to the current account surplus of the balance of payments, okay? Now, we could add all these gross expenditures, and we get what we used to call gross domestic or national, depending on which, when you were trained, expenditures in the economy. But there's the other side, which is the receipts. If we add up all the receipts, you're going to get, of course, all the income side here, okay? So these are all the income receipts that we added up in terms of wages, profits, etc., interest and rents and so on, okay? All of these are added up. Now, if you reorganize this equation and I subtract T, which are symbol for taxes, from each side, okay, so it stays the same otherwise, I get income minus taxes, which I'll call disposable income, okay? Now, taxes could be either like the GST, value-added taxes or whatever, or it could be, of course, the income tax. Doesn't matter in this case for now, okay? We'll just call it taxes. And of course, we do the same thing here, but I deduct it against G. Everything else has remained unchanged, as you could see here. G minus T is, of course, the government deficit. Okay? Government spending minus tax receipts here is going to give you, if it's positive, it's a deficit. If it's negative, it's a surplus. Okay? Now, if we also subtract consumption now further, C, from this, well, what do we get here? Y minus T, which is disposable income, minus C, which is consumption, gives you what we call savings, of households or firms, all of them included here, okay? And those are equal to the investment plus the government deficit plus the trade surplus or the current account surplus, okay? And I could rewrite this. Just a moment, I just realized that I had unplugged my computer and my battery is low. Okay, sorry. Just one moment. Okay, so what we have here now is that savings is equal to investment plus the government deficit plus the current account surplus. Now, we could reorganize this to say that all these differences, if we bring this to the other side, you'll have I minus S, which is investment minus savings, plus G minus T, which is the government deficit, plus the trade or the current account surplus, has to equal zero. We call this the Godel equation, named after a famous British economist. And now, if we assume, just to avoid the problem, X minus M here is zero, meaning that the current account is in balance, okay? Then we get this identity. It's a pure kind of accounting identity, which is that the government budget deficit has to equal the net private sector savings, S minus I. Now, this looks just like a lot of, mumbo jumbo here of equations, but it's an important identity because it says that every time you, let's say, you reduce the deficit, what you're doing is reducing the net private sector savings. Okay. Now, this is from the national accounting equations here, if you wish. Okay. I've just pulled out some data for Canada that I had available. I told Don I wouldn't try to update some of these graphs that I was able to pull out here because I have lack of time, but it gives you a good idea. I have this until 2020, from 1990 to 2020, which is the net lending of the two sectors that I regrouped when I abstracted from that the current account balance. Okay, so think of it. The current account balance is not in balance. It was something during those years. It could have been positive or negative, okay? But we simply focus on the two other balances here before that we, as you could see here, the G minus T and the S minus I, okay? Or what we call the net lending and then or borrowing of the non-financial private sector, which is, of course, the blue line here, dark continuous blue line. And we have the general government, general meaning that all levels of government combined, here for Canada, okay, federal, provincial, and municipal, net lending and borrowing. And what do you see here? It's not a mirror image of each other. The reason is for two reasons. One, actually, because we're using different data series than from the national accounts, but still, you should get pretty much a mirror almost, but also because, as I emphasized, the current account balance was not in balance in reality, so it would perturb a little bit those relations. Okay? Otherwise, it would have to be almost practically a mirror. But as you could see right away on the importance of this, when we look at let's say in the early 1990s, where we had big deficits until Chrétien and Martin came in, as we'll see in a minute, okay? We had these the dotted red line here, broken line rather. You could see it's negative territory as a percentage of GDP, okay? It became, as you could see, positive for a dozen years until when? Until the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And then it tried to get back into balance until when? Until, of course, the COVID crisis came along, the pandemic, okay? Now, as I said, I only have for 2020, because then it would have gone back. Now, I have some other data later that goes up to 2021 or 2022, if I remember correctly, and we'll show you that. But for this alone, you could see right away what happened. So the government was going, as I say, was out of balance, quote unquote, here initially. Then it kind of generated a surplus for about a dozen years, okay? From 1990, as you could see, 1996 here, all the way to 2008, okay? Then back into negative territory and then back up. And of course, during the pandemic, we had a big, in 2020, we had a huge deficit there, okay, that to deal with the pandemic, of course. And as we could see here, what mirrored that? It's the savings, okay, the net position of the household or the private sector, household and businesses combined here, okay, which were in a surplus territory. Then, as you could see there, we're going into the red here during the period of the Chrétien and Martin years. And then, of course, back and stayed that way throughout until when? Until, of course, the pandemic, okay, where we had a huge increase in the savings rate, okay? Now, I also have it disaggregated a little bit further, where I separated the household net lending or borrowing and the non-financial corporations net lending or borrowing, and then, of course, the government. Now, the government is the black one here, broken line, okay, as you could see, which is identical to what we had before, to the blue line, earlier graph. But the other ones are disaggregated. And if you look at that, for instance, in the early 1990s, the household sector was generating savings, significant savings, okay? And as you could see, it went into the red and never really came out of it until when? Until the pandemic, once again, okay? When the government started spending, running a deficit. So what can we possibly say about this? In looking at these charts, what is obvious is that when abstracting that, is that when, let's say we abstract from the foreign sector or current account balance, the series are almost a mirror image of each other, as we saw during that whole period, let's say, of the Chrétien Martin years, for instance, where they were running surpluses. And of course, this drove the private sector into the deficit and negative range. And of course, we also saw this most dramatic change during the COVID epidemic, where it kind of reversed itself, okay, at the time. Now, let's look further, though, who would impacts. Now, once again, I'm going to have to warn you that these series here are not identical to these here that I had to take from different sources, okay? And I had produced this for an article in a chapter of a book that it was actually it came out in Spanish, okay, in Mexico, but I had the graph here that I was able to produce for this book at the time, for a conference and then for the book. But in the last year of it, in 2020, I only had the first 3 quarters that I was able to pull out at the time. But it's important to see what happened here when we disaggregated further the household sector. We look at the savings out of disposable income, what happens? Now, there's actually a lot of fluctuations for each one of them. But because the graph, remember, where it's sort of fitting in all the data here, okay? If you look carefully, the lowest quintile, okay, has such dramatic fluctuations that the others look almost flat in comparison, okay? But even those are fluctuating a bit here, as you could detect. But if you did it separately, you would see that they're also fluctuating somewhat, okay? But even looking at what we have here, okay? First of all, the continuous blue line here is the average for all incomes, okay? As you can see, it's very low. It's almost zero, okay? Throughout the whole period from 1999 to 2020, okay? However, if we let's start with the highest quintile. This is think of it as the top 20% of households with the highest incomes in Canada. As we could see here, they do have a strong positive savings rate out of disposable income that was in the range of 30 to almost 40% by the time we got to the pandemic, okay? However, when we look at even the fourth, let's say, a quintile, to the top, okay, it goes down pretty quickly, okay, as we could see here, okay, close to the average almost. And then, of course, when we get to the third quintile, it's already in the negative range. Fourth quintile, pretty negative persistently. And of course, the lowest quintile of the population of households, as we could see, is not only always negative, but it's sort of barreling down there dramatically, okay? Throughout this period, until when? Well, until the pandemic. So thanks to that emergency funds that were paid out to everybody here, to some of these poorest of the poor here, what it did, it has allowed them to reduce their debt load during that period. Now, since then, it's gone back down, pretty sure. I don't have the data here, unfortunately, because I didn't have it available. But I would, for sure, it's followed, again, what's been going on with the deficit as well. But what we see here, that so-called just-in deficit, or whatever Poiliev calls it, did a lot of good things, and especially down at the bottom here. Okay, it kind of reduced their debt levels to, I wouldn't say a manageable level. Now, who are these people? Obviously, it tends to be students, for instance, who are borrowing just to pay their tuition and are struggling, to make ends meet, or also, other, really extremely poor in our society who are able to access credit. And remember, the really poor cannot even do that. Okay. So it's incredible to see how dramatically it went down over a period. And if we go back further to the 1980s, I don't have this data because it's more disjunctive data. It's not continuous data, but I've seen that going way back. You would see that we were pretty close to zero for the bottom one. So there's been a dramatic change. over the last 40 years or so that has created what is an over-indebted household sector, okay, and that has a lot to do, I would argue, not just with problems of income inequality, but also with the way governments tackled the problems of the public finances in our economy. Because of this desire to want to balance the books or run surpluses, what it does it on the back of the population, but on the back especially of the poorest in the population. Okay? Now, now I'd like to get on with this because I want to challenge much of what is this orthodoxy, this sort of mainstream view that we should not only not run deficits, as I've shown here, deficits are not necessarily a bad thing here. You know, maybe for the individual household, it could be a problem, but for the state, it can actually, you know, if you're a sovereign state with your own sovereign money, you do not face the same constraints as you do if you're a household, or indeed if you're a kind of country like the Eurozone, where they are not, they're no longer sovereign currency countries, okay, or dollarized regimes like, you know, Panama or Ecuador or whatever, that are, you know, El Salvador, whatever, that are not, that are dollarized, that do not have their own currencies even, okay, so that they cannot, in a sense, issue and create their own dollars, okay, and need to run trade surpluses with the United States to be able to access them, so to speak, these dollars, okay? But even in the Eurozone, as we're going to see, they've been getting away with things, as well, I'll show you, that they, in fact, can, even under the incredible constraints that have been imposed on these countries, as I'm going to show you, okay, through a process of what is normally referred to as quantitative easing, or QE, okay, which I'll explain in a minute, okay, they've been able to pretty much avoid the crises that they were facing, for instance, as we saw after the financial crisis, you know, in the Eurozone, where they were, you know, remember Greece going belly up there, and in a number of the countries, especially in the southern flank, there in the southern areas of the Eurozone, that were facing serious crises at the time, okay? Financial, you know, in nature here, because they, as I was saying here, they cannot access the central bank, so to speak, here, as would sovereign states like Canada, United States, that have their own currency, or Britain, for that matter, has retained its own currency, luckily. Okay, but that doesn't stop them, as Don was saying there, from running the, you know, by implementing these austerity kind of policies throughout. Okay, but at least they don't have the excuse that Greece had, or some of these other countries that faced havoc. Okay, now let me start here by. So I want to get into this because, in fact, it shows the hypocrisy, almost the way I would see it, of the mainstream, okay, in the way in which they tend to use this word called deficit monetization. That is to say, central bank financing government spending, okay, as a kind of dirty word, as something terrible, okay? Now, if we look at the recent experience, especially during the last two crises at the beginning of the 21st century, that is the global financial crisis, or the great financial crisis, as they sometimes call it, and of course the COVID, you know, 19 pandemic, you know, the crisis, okay? What we've seen, in fact, is that many of these so-called mainstream, very deeply rooted, I argue here, mainstream discourse, okay, of the last half century or so, have really changed a great deal. They changed a lot. And many of what I call the public spending inhibition, okay, by many of these policy authorities in most of the industrialized countries of North America and Western Europe, okay, what we've seen is really a change in both discourse and in policy until, of course, until after 2021, where we start seeing inflation on the horizon, okay? And it's been used as an excuse, as we're going to see, to put down what, in fact, they were doing, which was a good thing before, okay, to some extent, in dealing with the crises that we faced, okay? Now, let me just show you here. As I told you, I had a little more recent data. It's still 2022 here, but it's still, but you can see a little bit better here, okay? And I have this for a group of countries, a select group that I pulled out, that I was able to get data quickly at the time. That, as I said, it was done for another paper that I had written about a year and a half ago. But if you look at this here, you could see, of course, that once again, Canada stands out pretty high up there. Okay? The blue line is Canada. And guess which other country stands out a lot? The dark one, broken dark one, is Germany. Okay. These are the two countries, the superstars here, let's call them, in trying to achieve surpluses over the last 30 years. Okay. And look at other countries, like take the United States, okay? You could see how far, look at how much more they ran a deficit at the beginning of the pandemic compared to Canada. We ran a pretty big deficit as well, but look at the US here, how much more they did, quote unquote, in comparison, okay, in terms of running a deficit. Okay, but we had other countries. I put Greece in there because they were the basket case of Europe, quote unquote, to use the terminology, especially the Germans have used against Greece. Okay, but in fact, we could see how they were really pressured to go into surplus almost territory. Okay, now a lot of this has happened, however, in a kind of weird way that I'm going to explain to you in a minute. But just to show you the landscape here in terms of government net spending or net lending and borrowing here, okay, of these various countries, how we pretty much move in tandem, but at the same time, we also tend to, because we are facing the same kind of crises, okay, that become international in nature, the pandemic, of course, the global financial crisis and so on here. And of course, how we kind of try to trip over each other in order to try to go back to surpluses, but only some countries are able to do so. Others were unable to do so, not because they didn't try, but because it's so difficult, okay? And because of what it imposes on these populations, as we were saying earlier, okay? Now, what we have witnessed, therefore, was the adoption and implementing internationally of what were during both the global financial crisis, but also during the pandemic, of these, fairly, let's say, peak deficits that were reached at the time. And after the last global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, starting in March 2020, all these governments in the industrialized world pursued, once again, policies of running large budget deficits for stabilization purposes, as we saw during the pandemic. And however, now in early 2022, central banks began actively to combat inflation. Now, they had been doing so before. I mean, remember, the Bank of Canada, for instance, has a single mandate, which is that of 2% inflation target, okay? But during the period at the beginning of the pandemic, we were actually in 2020, we were almost facing a deflation, not an inflation. And what happened was only when, economic activities began to pick up a great deal, that we started seeing problems of supply chain. Remember those terms there? Temporary supply chain problems of inflation. Rising markups because of local monopolies, as they're trying to hold on to stocks of things that others may not have because they don't access the same supply chains and so on. And then, of course, the big mama of the inflation shock was Ukraine war, okay, which really changed the discourse of central banks, because until then, everybody, including the Bank of Canada, was thinking that we're not going to see any serious inflation. The little inflation that we're going to see, like in 2021, towards the end of 2021, would be a temporary phenomenon, not something that would actually go on, for too long. Instead, what we see is of course, by the time we get to 2022, because of especially oil prices that shoot up, due to the fact that one of the suppliers all of a sudden, which is Russia, no longer is in the game here of supplying as much gas and oil and so on to Western countries, and this caused big problems. Okay?
Mario, it's Don here.
Yep.
We're having fun, but we're going to get kicked out in about 15
Yeah, okay. I will.
Right.
Look, I'm just going to say a couple of things, and then I'll summarize. Is that okay?
Yep.
But I did want to mention that what we've seen, and I'll just skip all this here because it's I want to show to you that even with quantitative easing, okay, they were still indirectly monetizing these deficits, even in the Eurozone, where it's illegal, starting with the Maastricht Treaty. Okay, they were doing that. I won't have time to go through that, and I apologize. I should have been checking my watch, which I didn't. Okay, but I just want to show you here that in Canada, okay, we do either direct purchases from, let's say, the central bank, does either direct purchases on the primary market for government securities that are issued each month or whatever, as well as in the secondary market, which is what we call quantitative easing, that they stopped. They've been doing quantitative tightening since 2022. They got rid of that. But as you could see here, I have both the primary purchases, which are the red, and the blue ones, which are so the Bank of Canada does that all the time. And yet the inflation has nothing to do with that. And indeed, inflation, as I'm going to try to show you, is not directly connected at all with budget deficits, whether they're financed one way or the other. It doesn't matter. Okay. Now, I'm going to summarize what I said before, but I'm just going to jump a lot of this because I did spend enough time on money here and all that. I'm going to skip all that, but I just want to show you something that is important here, which has to do, and this is a graph. I had it from an article that I wrote recently, but for the US in this case, but it's still the same thing for Canada. And you can see here that these are the budgetary deficit, which is the blue one. Okay, so in this case, it's the opposite of what we usually think. It's the deficit is positive term here in order to show how it links up with inflation. If you were to believe, let's say, Poiliev or many of these people, then of course deficits should have generated inflation. And what we tend to see, in fact, is the complete opposite. What we see is that they are moving in almost in an inverse direction. Okay, so you cannot argue based on certain facts here that I could show you that somehow deficits cause inflation here. It doesn't work that way. Now, I don't have time to get into the whole bit here on this, but I just want to emphasize the fact that the actual relationship empirically is not positive between deficit spending and inflation. It's negative. Okay, and what I want to argue, though, and this is why I think it's important, is unlike many countries of the world, okay, I've always argued that most of the principal assertions pertaining to modern monetary theory, MMT, based on this charterist notion that a sovereign state can issue its own debt on itself, via its central bank, without facing these limits that are highlighted all the time, that we're going to end up into a disaster zone, okay, apply really very well for a country like Canada. First thing, it has all the institutions that can make it easy. First, the Bank of Canada is not institutionally independent, as is the US Fed, or in our continent here, the Banco de Mexico. In fact, in 1961, there was established a legal precedence, okay, that whenever there's any disagreement between the goals of the governor of the Bank of Canada, or the Minister of Finance, or the government in place, okay, that the governor must resign and make way for a new appointment by the elected government. This was under the conservatives excuse me, where did I put this? Okay, sorry. This was under at the time was under Diefenbaker, and it came to be called the Coin Affair, okay? And nobody has ever contested it since then. So there is a kind of legal precedence here, literally. Second, as we've been seeing from our previous discussion, there are no legal impediments for the Bank of Canada to actually purchase government securities, whether it be directly on the primary market, or as in the Eurozone, in the secondary one. Okay, it could do so without problems. It doesn't face all these other, for instance, laws like in Mexico, where they cannot, by law, finance government, or in the case of congressional debt ceilings in the U.S., which clearly, again, create all kinds of impediments for the state. Okay. Third, except for a short period between 1962 and 1970, when we adopted a fixed exchange rate with bands at the time, since 1950, Canada's always been floating the exchange rate. And in fact, we have a pure float since 1998 for over 25 years right now. So, and that's important in terms of MMT stuff, because of course, it's not a further impediment for how the central bank would have to behave in a case of fixed exchange rates, or if they're dollarized, which would be completely impossible then to run it. Now, these are the crucial features that I think institutionally would make it possible to have something akin to, to MMT sort of policies in Canada. And we did do it indirectly, as I said, throughout this period of the pandemic or during the financial crisis. Now, I just like to read this, and I'll stop there, which is a statement from Chrystia Freeland in October 28th of 2020. Okay, I have the reference there if anybody is interested. I am not going to read this part here because I don't have time, but she's saying how wonderful it is that, we are in a position to run deficits at the time in order to fight the pandemic, of course, to tackle the pandemic, okay? But then she continues, having said that, let me offer this important caveat. While advocating expansive fiscal policy to battle COVID-19 and to grow our way out of a coronavirus recession, I am not among those who think Canada should have a fling with modern monetary theory, which holds that deficits don't matter for a government that issues debt in its own currency. Whether on Bay Street or Main Street, there are no blank checks and there are no free lunches. Our fiscal expansive approach to fighting the coronavirus cannot and will not be infinite. It is limited and temporary. A smart and careful government, and those are two adjectives that I would use to characterize our policy, will impose those limits upon itself, rather than waiting for the more brutal external restraints of international capital markets. Well, what I've like to pose this question: why is Canada's political elites, why are they so openly hostile to MMT ideas, despite the fact that our actual experience, for instance, as I've been at the beginning of the pandemic, proved that it actually worked pretty well, okay? And this is because we often use very misleading analogies of the management of a prudent sort of Canadian household and about the fears of brutal and financial markets that will really, put us at our place as they did with Greece, for instance, in 2012, whenever it was. Now, I'm just going to give you this last thing here. In Canada, the gross debt to GDP is below 70%. It's around 68%. Japan in 2022, and it's similar, I think today, but I was able to find it for 2022, was 264%. Okay? Debt to GDP ratio. And yet the sky in Japan has not fallen. Okay? They've had problems, but their problems is how to get out of deflation, if anything, historically. Anyways, I'll stop there. My apologies for having taken so long.
So thank you, Mario. But look, let me ask you a question before asking for questions. Therefore, can we afford a Green New Deal? Can we afford a better healthcare service? Can we afford to give students an education? And the operative word is, can we afford?
Yeah. As I was trying to argue from the beginning, in countries which have their own sovereign currencies and are willing to float their exchange rate, okay, which is what we do here, by the way. As I said, we've been doing this since 1950, okay, except for a short 8 year period between 62 and 70, okay? We've been always floating the exchange rate. If we have those as conditions, we can afford a New Deal, as long as, and I emphasize this, as long as we cannot go over and above the physical constraints, whether it be human or employment, in other words, human or actual physical constraints in terms of capital and resources. Okay, our real constraints are those, not the financial one. Okay,
we can afford 100% employment, but we can't afford 120% employment.
Absolutely.
Does anybody have any questions? No? So well, Mario, thanks very much. It's been a tremendous talk, and I should say I've gone down the MMT rabbit hole, which is how I got to meet Warren Mosler and therefore Mario. My wife kicks me under the table when I start talking about it, but I hope you've all enjoyed tonight's presentation. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you I'm very honored to have been invited here. And I wish to also emphasize the fact that I'm not one who goes around, defending that we should do anything, to spend money left and right. It's just not at all what MMT is all about, or what, most heterodox sort of non-mainstream economists think. Rather, what we should do is focus on what are the needs of society, because what is physically possible, okay, this is Keynes, but what is physically possible is also financially possible in our society. The constraint is not the finance, and we should not use that as an excuse on the part of the state here to be able to, in this case, help people. Imagine if they did not do a thing during the pandemic, what we would have had a situation, okay? Why then should we not do what they did then, which was, I would say, half successful, if not very successful, okay, during the pandemic. We were able to, get people vaccines, you name it, okay, and did not have any constraints on that, but on obtaining that. Okay, so why is it that we were able to do that then, and now we are facing these, problems supposedly that that are being invented, basically, the way I see it, because we're in no different position than we were then.
Okay. So thank you again. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I apologize for having taken so long here. Yeah.